Story 9 of Further Chronicles of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Story 9, Sarah's Way. Narrated by Beth Thomas.
Mrs. Jonas, read by Christine G.
Mrs. Eben, read by Sarah Holtz.
Sarah, read by Savannah Allday.
Mrs. George Pye, read by Amanda Friday.
Mrs. Rachel Lynde, read by Lynn Thompson.
Mrs. Harmon Andrews, by Ethel Bus.
Mr. Harmon Andrews, read by Frances Brown.
Liege Baxter, read by Beth Thomas.
The warm June sunshine was coming down through the trees, white with the virginal bloom of apple blossoms, and through the shining panes making a tremulous mosaic upon Mrs. Eben Andrews' spotless kitchen floor. Through the open door a wind, fragrant from long wanderings over orchards and clover meadows, drifted in, and from the window Mrs. Eben and her guest could look down over the long misty valley sloping to a sparkling sea. Mrs. Jonas Andrews was spending the afternoon with her sister-in-law. She was a big, sonsy woman with full-blown peony cheeks and large, dreamy brown eyes. When she had been a slim pink and white girl, those eyes had been very romantic. Now they were so out of keeping with the rest of her appearance as to be ludicrous. Mrs. Eben, sitting at the other end of a small tea-table that was drawn up against the window, was a thin little woman with a very sharp nose and light, faded blue eyes. She looked like a woman whose opinions were always very decided and warranted to wear.
How does Sarah like teaching at Newbridge?
Asked Mrs. Jonas, helping herself a second time to Mrs. Eben's matchless black fruit cake, and thereby bestowing a subtle compliment which Mrs. Eben did not fail to appreciate.
Well, I guess she likes it pretty well. Better than down at White Sands, anyway,
answered Mrs. Eben.
Yes, I may say it suits her. Of course, it's a long walk there and back. I think it would have been wiser for her to keep on boarding at Morrison's as she did all winter, but Sarah's bound to be home all she can. And I must say the walk seems to agree with her.
I was down to see Jonas's aunt at Newbridge last night,
said Mrs. Jonas.
And she said she'd heard that Sarah had made up her mind to take Liege Baxter at last, and that they were to be married in the fall. She asked me if it was true. I said I didn't know, but I hope to mercy it was. Now, is it, Louisa?
Not a word of it,
said Mrs. Eben sorrowfully.
Sarah hasn't any more notion of taking Lidge than ever she had. I'm sure it's not my fault. I've talked and argued till I'm tired. I declare to you, Amelia, I am terribly disappointed. I'd set my heart on Sarah's marrying Lidge, and now to think she won't.
She's a very foolish girl,
said Mrs. Jonas judicially.
If Liege Baxter isn't good enough for her, who is?
And he's so well off,
said Mrs. Eben.
And does such good business and is well spoken of by everyone. And that lovely new house of his at Newbridge with bay windows and hardwood floors. I've dreamed and dreamed of seeing Sarah there as mistress.
Maybe you'll see her there yet,
said Mrs. Jonas, who always took a hopeful view of everything, even of Sarah's contrariness. But she felt discouraged too. Well, she had done her best. If Liege Baxter's broth was spoiled, it was not for lack of cooks. Every Andrews in Avonlea had been trying for 2 years to bring about a match between him and Sarah, and Mrs. Jonas had borne her part valiantly. Mrs. Eben's despondent reply was cut short by the appearance of Sarah herself. The girl stood for a moment in the doorway and looked with a faintly amused air at her aunts. She knew quite well that they had been discussing her, for Mrs. Jonas, who carried her conscience in her face, looked guilty, and Mrs. Eben had not been able wholly to banish her aggrieved expression. Sarah put away her books, kissed Mrs. Jonas's rosy cheek, and sat down at the table. Mrs. Eben brought her some fresh tea, some hot rolls, and a little jelly pot of the apricot preserve Sarah liked, and she cut some more fruit cake for her in moist, plummy slices. She might be out of patience with Sarah's contrariness, but she spoiled and petted her for all that, for the girl was the very core of her childless heart. Sarah Andrews was not, strictly speaking, pretty, but there was that about her which made people look at her twice. She was very dark, with a rich, dusky sort of darkness. Her deep eyes were velvety brown, and her cheeks and lips were crimson. She ate her rolls and preserves with a healthy appetite, sharpened by her long walk from Newbridge, and told amusing little stories of her day's work that made the 2 older women shake with laughter, and exchanged shy glances of pride over her cleverness. When tea was over, she poured the remaining contents of the cream jug into a saucer.
I must feed my pussy,
she said as she left the room.
That girl beats me,
said Mrs. Eben with a sigh of perplexity.
You know that black cat we've had for 2 years? Eben and I have always made a lot of him, but Sarah seemed to have a dislike to him. Never a peaceful nap under the stove could he have when Sarah was home. Out he must go. Well, a little spell ago he got his leg broke accidentally, and we thought he'd have to be killed. But Sarah wouldn't hear of it. She got splints and set his leg just as knacky, and bandaged it up, and she has tended him like a sick baby ever since. He's just about well now, and he lives in clover, that cat does. It's just her way. There's them sick chickens she's been doctoring for a week, giving them pills and things. And she thinks more of that wretched-looking calf that got poisoned with Paris green than of all the other stock on the place.
As the summer wore away, Mrs. Eben tried to reconcile herself to the destruction of her air castles, but she scolded Sarah considerably.
Sarah, why don't you like Lidge? I'm sure he's a model young man.
I don't like model young men,
answered Sarah impatiently.
and I really think I hate Lige Baxter. He has always been held up to me as such a paragon. I'm tired of hearing about all his perfections. I know them all off by heart. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't steal, he doesn't tell fibs, he never loses his temper, he doesn't swear, and he goes to church regularly. Such a faultless creature as that would certainly get on my nerves. No, you'll have to pick out another mistress for your new house at the bridge, Aunt Louisa.
When the apple trees that had been pink and white in June were russet and bronze in October, Mrs. Eben had a quilting. The quilt was of the rising star pattern, which was considered in Avonlea to be very handsome. Mrs. Eben had intended it for part of Sarah's setting out, and while she sewed the red and white diamonds together, she had regaled her fancy by imagining she saw it spread out on the spare-room bed of a house at Newbridge, with herself laying her bonnet and shawl on it when she went to see Sarah. Those bright visions had faded with the apple blossoms, and Mrs. Eben hardly had the heart to finish the quilt at all. The quilting came off on Saturday afternoon, when Sarah could be home from school. All Mrs. Eben's particular friends were ranged around the quilt, and tongues and fingers flew. Sarah flitted about, helping her aunt with the supper preparations. She was in the room getting the custard dishes out of the cupboard when Mrs. George Pye arrived. Mrs. George had a genius for being late. She was later than usual today, and she looked excited. Every woman around the Rising Star felt that Mrs. George had some news worth listening to, and there was an expectant silence while she pulled out her chair and settled herself at the quilt. She was a tall, thin woman with a long face and liquid green eyes. As she looked around the circle, she had the air of a cat daintily licking its chops over some titbit.
"I suppose,"
she said,
"that you have heard the news?"
She knew perfectly well that they had not. Every other woman at the frame stopped quilting. Mrs. Eben came to the door with a pan of puffy, smoking-hot soda biscuits in her hand. Sarah stopped counting the custard dishes and turned her ripely coloured face over her shoulder. Even the black cat at her feet ceased preening his fur. Mrs. George felt that the undivided attention of the audience was hers.
"Baxter Brothers have failed,"
she said, her green eyes shooting out flashes of light.
"Failed disgracefully."
She paused for a moment, but since her hearers were as yet speechless from surprise, she went on.
"George came home from Newbridge just before I left, with the news. You could have knocked me down with a feather. I should have thought that firm was as steady as the Rock of Gibraltar. But they're ruined, absolutely ruined. Louisa, dear, can you find me a good needle?"
Louisa dear had set her biscuits down with a sharp thud, reckless of results. A sharp metallic tinkle sounded at the closet where Sarah had struck the edge of her tray against a shelf. The sound seemed to loosen the paralysed tongues, and everybody began talking and exclaiming at once. Clear and shrill above the confusion rose Mrs. George Pye's voice.
"Yes, indeed, you may well say so. It is disgraceful. And to think how everybody trusted them. George will lose considerable by the crash, and so will a good many folks. Everything will have to go. Peter Baxter's farm and Lige's grand new house. Mrs. Peter won't carry her head so high after this, I'll be bound. George saw Lige at the bridge, and he said he looked dreadful cut up and ashamed."
Who or what's to blame for the failure?
asked Mrs. Rachel Lynde sharply. She did not like Mrs. George Pye.
"There are a dozen different stories on the go,"
was the reply.
"As far as George could make out, Peter Baxter has been speculating with other folks' money, and this is the result. Everybody always suspected that Peter was crooked. But you'd have thought that Lige would have kept him straight. He had always such a reputation for saintliness."
I don't suppose Lige knew anything about it,
said Mrs. Rachel indignantly.
Well, he ought to, then. If he isn't a knave, he's a fool.
said Mrs. Harmon Andrews, who had formerly been amongst his warmest partisans.
He should have kept watch on Peter and found out how the business was being run. Well, Sarah, you were the level-headedest of us all. I admit that now. A nice mess it would be if you were married or engaged to Lige, and him left without a cent, even if he can clear his character.
There was a good deal of talk about Peter, and swindling, and a lawsuit,
said Mrs. George Pye, quilting industriously.
Most of the Newbridge folks think it's all Peter's fault, and that Lige isn't to blame. But you can't tell. I dare say Lige is as deep in the mire as Peter. He was always a little too good to be wholesome, I thought.
There was a clink of glass at the cupboard as Sarah set the tray down. She came forward and stood behind Mrs. Rachel Lynde's chair, resting her shapely hands on that lady's broad shoulders. Her face was very pale, but her flashing eyes sought and faced defiantly Mrs. George Pye's cat-like orbs. Her voice quivered with passion and contempt.
You'll all have a fling at Lige Baxter now that he's down. You couldn't say enough in his praise once. I'll not stand by and hear it hinted that Lige Baxter is a swindler. You'll know perfectly well that Lige is as honest as the day, if he is so unfortunate as to have an unprincipled brother. You, Mrs. Pye, know better than anyone, yet you come here and run him down the minute he's in trouble. If there's another word said here against Lige Baxter, I'll leave the room and the house till you're gone, every one of you.
She flashed a glance around the quilt that cowed the gossips. Even Mrs. George Pye's eyes flickered and waned and quailed. Nothing more was said until Sarah had picked up her glasses and marched from the room. Even then they dared not speak above a whisper. Mrs. Pye alone, smarting from the snub, ventured to ejaculate,
"Pity save us!"
as Sarah slammed the door. For the next fortnight gossip and rumour held high carnival in Avonlea and Newbridge, and Mrs. Eben grew to dread the sight of a visitor.
They're bound to talk about the Baxter failure and criticize Lige,
she deplored to Mrs. Jonas.
And it riles Sarah up so terrible. She used to declare that she hated Lige, and now she won't listen to a word against him. Not that I say any myself. I'm sorry for him, and I believe he's done his best, but I can't stop other people from talking.
One evening Harmon Andrews came in with a fresh budget of news.
The Baxter business is pretty near wound up at last,
he said as he lighted his pipe.
Peter has got his lawsuit settled and has hushed up the talk about swindling somehow. Trust him for slipping out of a scrape clean and clever. He don't seem to worry any, but Lige looks like a walking skeleton. Some folks pity him, but I say he should have kept the run of things better and not have trusted everything to Peter. I hear he's going out west in the spring to take up land in Alberta and try his hand at farming. Best thing he can do, I guess. Folks hereabouts have had enough of the Baxter breed. Newbridge will be well rid of them.
Sarah, who'd been sitting in the dark corner by the stove, suddenly stood up, letting the black cat slip from her lap to the floor. Mrs. Eben glanced at her apprehensively, for she was afraid the girl was going to break out in a tirade against the complacent Harmon. But Sarah only walked fiercely out of the kitchen with a sound as if she were struggling for breath. In the hall she snatched a scarf from the wall, flung open the front door, and rushed down the lane in the chill, pure air of the autumn twilight. Her heart was throbbing with the pity she always felt for bruised and baited creatures. On and on she went heedlessly, intent only on walking away her pain over grey, brooding fields and winding slopes, and along the skirts of ruinous, dusky pine woods, curtained with fine spun-purple gloom. Her dress brushed against the brittle grasses and sere ferns, and the moist night wind, loosened from wild places far away, blew her hair about her face. At last she came to a little rustic gate leading into a shadowy wood lane. The gate was bound with willow withes, and as Sarah fumbled vainly at them with her chilled hands, a man's firm step came up behind her, and Lige Baxter's hand closed over hers.
"Oh, Lige," she
said with something like a sob. He opened the gate and drew her through. She left her hand in his, and as they walked through the lane where lissom boughs of young saplings flicked against their heads, and the air was wildly sweet with woodsy odours.
"It's a long while since I've seen you, Lige,"
Sarah said at last. Lige looked wistfully down at her through the gloom.
Yes, it seems very long to me, Sarah, but I didn't think you'd care to see me after what you said last spring. And you know things have been going against me. People have said hard things. I've been unfortunate, Sarah, and maybe too easygoing, but I've been honest. Don't believe folks if they tell you I wasn't.
"Indeed, I never did. Not for a minute,"
fired Sarah.
I'm glad of that. I'm going away later on. I felt bad enough when you refused to marry me, Sarah, but it's well that you didn't. I'm man enough to be thankful my troubles don't fall on you.
Sarah stopped and turned to him. Beyond them the lane opened into a field, and a clear lake of crocus sky cast a dim light into the shadow where they stood. Above it was a new moon like a gleaming silver scimitar. Sarah saw it was over her left shoulder, and she saw Lige's face above her, tender and troubled.
Lige,
she said softly.
do you love me still?
You know I do,
said Lige sadly. That was all Sarah wanted. With a quick movement she nestled into his arms and laid her warm, tear-wet cheek against his cold one. When the amazing rumour that Sarah was going to marry Lige Baxter and go out west with him circulated through the Andrews clan, hands were lifted and heads were shaken. Mrs. Jonas puffed and panted up the hill to learn if it were true. She found Mrs. Eben stitching for dear life on an Irish chain quilt, while Sarah was sewing the diamonds on another rising star with a martyr-like expression on her face. Sarah hated patchwork above everything else, but Mrs. Eben was mistress up to a certain point.
You'll have to make that quilt, Sarah Andrews. If you're going to live out on those prairies, you'll need piles of quilts, and you shall have them if I sew my fingers to the bone. But you'll have to help make them.
And Sarah had to. When Mrs. Jonas came, Mrs. Eben sent Sarah off to the post office to get her out of the way.
I suppose it's true this time,
said Mrs. Jonas.
Yes, indeed,
said Mrs. Eben briskly.
Sarah is set on it. There is no use trying to move her, you know that, so I've just concluded to make the best of it. I'm no turncoat. Lige Baxter is Lige Baxter still, neither more nor less. I've always said he's a fine young man, and I say so still. After all, he and Sarah won't be any poorer than Eben and I were when we started out.
Mrs. Jonas heaved a sigh of relief.
I'm real glad you take that view of it, Louisa. I'm not displeased either, although Mrs. Harmon would take my head off if she heard me say so. I always liked Lige, but I must say I'm amazed, too, after the way Sarah used to rail at him.
Well, we might have expected it,
said Mrs. Eben sagely.
It was always Sarah's way. When any creature got sick or unfortunate, she seemed to take it right into her heart. So you may say Lige Baxter's failure was a success after all.
End of Story 9.